Um, there's questions coming in here about how do we manage that on an ongoing basis rather than just being a reactive basis each time. Andrew Rogers says, how do you manage risk and the methodology? It has so many times I'm only brought to the table when it has punched people on the nose. So how do we become recognized? And I think you mentioned it, Jack, as having ROI, having return on investment, adding value. Because in so many cases, we are seen as people who are disruptive. We don't add value. We have to be in the room. Oh my God, let's have you in the room, but seriously, try not to make too much trouble for us. And it should be the other way around. We should be people who come in and people should be joyful. They should say, great, now we can really, this is
Mm.
transformational. If we can make that happen, then good luck to us all. Jack, I'm sorry. I mean, you've alluded to it. I mean, a lot of the times we are trying to fight the very organizations we're trying to help, aren't we?
Oh, absolutely. And I think a large part of that comes from our own what we the attitudes we bring to the table, and not just the attitudes, but our own methods and those sorts of things. So when I was CISO at Nationwide Insurance in the States, this was my first CISO job, and it's also the role that drove me to try to understand risk and measure risk. But when I came in the door, I my staff and I were not welcome in meetings and those. The organization routinely avoided us in key meetings and those sorts of things. And it was we were considered the department of no, as in no, you can't do that, right? And so what I did is I forbade anyone in my organization from saying no. I said, we do not have the power to say no. We're here as educators, facilitators, and problem solvers. That's our role, right? And I said, although you don't have the power to say no, you have the power to say this, whatever problem might be on the table that, we might have in the past said no to. We might say, well, we don't think you have whoever we're speaking with, you have the authority to make that decision. We need to kick that up the food chain, right? But so I guess in short, there were three things. We removed the power to say no. We got clarity on what our actual role was, educators, facilitators, and problem solvers. And we brought to the table a framework, this FAIR model that I created, that allowed us to clearly dissect and discuss and brainstorm about these problems that had been considered, intractable, right? This question of how much risk and those sorts of things. And so I think when it comes to something like culture, we can come to this table with some of the same mindsets, but I think crucially, ORCS gives us this framework for, again, better clarity and discussion around the problems, the challenges we might be facing. So I think we can reduce the perception of us being, something to be avoided, and instead something that provides value in the conversation. My organization's problem, after say a year or so of implementing these changes in approach and whatnot, my problem became I didn't have enough people to attend the meetings we were being invited to. And that's a terrific problem to have, right? You're doing something right when, in terms of the perception of you and your organization, when that's the problem you're wrestling with. So I think, we can get around that.
Gavin, I want to come to you on that. But I'm going to also bring in something that Ian Fox put in into the question and answer. If you're going the wrong way, sorry, if you're going the wrong way, you're only going to increase the potential for error rather than reducing it. Human beings aren't machines, and although there are an awful lot of correlations, then surely it's critical wherever we choose to measure must also be measurable, especially when it comes to human interactions. So we've spoken about the processes. Jack's spoken about the human interactions because at the end of the day, it's politics. Politics is the art of getting stuff done. Politics is the art of being seen as as somebody who's adding value to the conversation rather than taking away. So we're all involved in getting stuff done. We all have to be influenced. We're all influencers in some way. Um, we're coming down to the last third of this session, which is the time is passing. So in terms of influencing it and articulating it and positioning it as a value adding thing. How well are we doing as a community? You know, we're doing this as a community, all of us. And what does the orcs bring that will add value to that conversation?
There's a few aspects to discuss there. I think a couple of things just to add a little bit to the earlier question around how do you get proactive? How do you get a seat at the table? How do you get engaged and ensure that you can add value pre as opposed to just being called in to tick and flick or after the situation? And you know that's been a conundrum. I think anyone who's worked in any protective or risk field for a significant amount of time has felt the frustration of budget being stripped away because nothing bad has happened because you're performing really well, or you've got the right mix of skills and people and resources to deal with a threat. When those things get taken away, vulnerability manifests and bad stuff happens. I wrote an article about that with Professor Minot in 2012, I think, and 13 again. We called it the reactive security safety spending model. And it was literally showing this frustration pathway and that organizations tend to lose more money with reactive budgeting than they do with proactive risk-based budgeting over time. And even though at times organizations think they're saving money because they're not spending, as soon as there's a disruption, obviously costs shoot up and their response is much higher. If you're in the USA, have a look at corporations spend on executive protection post the United Healthcare shooting as an example. You'll see there's interesting expenditure there because it's a reactive expenditure that's probably not risk-based. Topic for another time. But simplistically put, start with you. If you don't have a seat at the table, if you're frustrated that people aren't listening, start addressing those issues. And I can say with confidence that all three of us on this call have had to do that in our own careers. We got academic qualifications, we upskilled our knowledge, we built networks, we got mentored, we put the hard work in, and eventually people start respecting you and want to know what you think. And if that never happens, that might be the answer that you're in the wrong culture, that you can't influence, and maybe you need to find another job. And the better you make yourself, the more likely you are to find a better job too. So it's a win-win from that perspective as well. So many times I find people are frustrated because they don't have the tools to solve the problem. They don't necessarily upskill themselves. They want the organization to change around them. It's very unlikely that succeeds, right? You're far better placed if you've got the ability to adapt and to motivate good response for adaptation, because then people will follow you. That's a whole lot of practice. One last comment. I did see that Ilko's just asked a question in the chat box about why did we call it a standard and gave some suggestions there. I'm sure Jack will recall there was some robust discussion around whether we call this a guideline or a standard, about whether we just put this out as guidance, whether we just share. But because we put metrics to it, because there's a systemized methodology behind it, and because we're standardizing a body of work in a way that over a period of time, we should be able to get cross metrics across industries and sectors because we're measuring on the same standard. We've got the makings of a standard. We did decide, though, that it needs to be an open standard. In other words, we don't want people to have to pay to use it. And we've also put in place an annual review process, knowing that it will likely change on an ongoing basis. We've already got a bunch of changes sitting ready to be made. The most exciting piece that I'm seeing at the moment, though, is even today we've had 2 organizations reach out to us that want to try it and want to test it, and they want to be the guinea pigs for it. And these are the one is quite a risk immature organization. So it's interesting to see it's not just being adopted by those that have the resources. It's also those who don't, who are going, how do we bring risk into our lifeblood? So it's kind of interesting. I hope that answers the question. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Gav. There's a question in the question and answer from Ronio Barrios. Thank you, Ronio. How do organizations ensure that ORCS builds a culture of risk ownership and judgment rather than reinforcing fear of failure and overly cautious decision making? And that's a great question, because sometimes we can use these prescriptive frameworks to avoid decision making and to actually to shrink our world rather than expand our world. Um, Jack, would you like to come in on that?
Sure, I think it's a great observation and a great question. So, again, going back to my experience with the models I developed for measuring and managing risk, they weren't prescriptive at all. They're models for decomposing complex questions or problems into digestible, measurable chunks that that I characterize as frameworks for critical thinking. Rather, that is what they are first and foremost, right? So they're a way to better understand the questions we're faced with, the challenges we're faced with, and have better discussions and make better decisions, regardless of whether we're measuring quantitatively, qualitatively, or even measuring at all. In fact, I've seen many instances where just having this model for decomposing a complex question leads whoever's involved to a clear answer without having to measure anything. So I think at the end of the day, again, something like ORCS is this framework for critical examination and for having hopefully open and honest discussions about where an organization is and where it wants to be. And so there's nothing prescriptive about that, right? That should open doors in conversations rather than close them, I think.
It's interesting because I think that leads segues nicely into Kevin Foster. Thank you for yours. In dynamic operational environments, would it not be wise to have a dynamic change of risk culture to ensure that the organization fits with its environment? How does this need for adaptability and risk control system response fit with the standards? So, you know, that Gav, you mentioned that, to be adaptable, to be agile, to be sensitive to your risk environment, which, let's face it, is changing in ways. We're seeing this on a weekly basis now. If you think you can do this based on your frameworks from 2018, then, as the Americans say, you've missed the memo, my friend. Um, and that's just going to go. That change is exponential to the power of exponential. How do we engage with that? Good question.
Great question, Kev. Once you've worked through the standard, let's chat because I think you're going to be very happy. We've built aspects like elasticity, resilience, and presilience into the way we measure for these things. We were really careful in drafting this. It would have been very easy to draft something that was quite binary and fixed and tied to, most sort of company director governance models. That would have created a lot of rigidity, and probably would have been far easier to apply, but it would have added no value in practice. We needed to make sure that what we've actually done is created a risk culture that will work today and in the future we're moving to. So when you actually look at the standard, it's not just the elasticity or adaptive elasticity aspects that are worked in there. It's aspects like risk intelligence, and are we actually building that into the lifeblood of the organization? It's technological adoption, because you might have the best risk management system, but if you're still doing it on pen and paper and you're a global organization, you're probably in trouble. So simplistically put, there's so much opportunity here to keep evolving this, developing this, and getting this further. This discussion has made me very happy. I know Jack's enjoyed it too. We need this discussion to be happening regularly so that we can get better at this stuff. We don't even know yet how these metrics are going to stack up when we start doing, say, cross-industry comparison. So there's so much learning that's going to come. My request is have a play, have a try, because if you're not using these variables, and this probably leads to the last part of the earlier question, can ORCS be used for evil? I'd probably say if that is the outcome you're getting, you've already got the answer to where your risk culture sits. If that is a concern for you, you obviously have a comparatively low trust organization. And trust is one of those metrics that's crucially important and sprinkled throughout ORCS, because you don't get good data in, which means you can't get good decision making without trust. So part of the process with this methodology is bite-sized chunks. You don't have to take all 10 aspects of the standard and apply it in one go. You might want to take just your department, take one of the standard options, so one of the 10 pieces, and just start tinkering with it in a safe way to get comfortable. Okay, and we've had quite a few people come back to us who've done that quite successfully and are building a lot of confidence in scaling this through their organization. And the short answer is, if it's not making it better, don't do it. And if it's hurting a lot, and it probably will if you start digging into these things, remember one of the signs of a growing risk culture being successful is an increase in reporting, is an increase in engagement when it comes to risk. So often that's perceived as a bad thing because you never knew about all these problems. Now you know about all these problems. So just be ready for that as an early sign of success. Thank you.
I'm always amazed. I look at consultants and they go into somebody's office. And when they go to that person's office, that person has 7 problems. And then the consultant leaves and they've got 14 problems. And they go, I'm not quite sure where you've added value. Thank you very much. Seriously,